My nickname after sharing my story with all of these guys was the train wreck.
And speaking of shit shows, my guest today is one of my dear friends, John Flynn. He's got an amazing story that includes massive success, overcoming addiction, and also significant trauma.
I was drinking actually pretty heavily even before high school ended. Come into 1989, we just decide, okay, this marriage isn't working, you're not around, and we decide to separate. Here we are, going gangbusters. We're coming into the end of 2019 when we're going to make that announcement that we're going to go public. And on the end of December, the day we're announcing that we're going to do that, I get a call that my 40-year-old daughter was found dead from an accidental overdose with 3 young children. So for me to try to stay focused from January 1st until June 10th when we went public was a real mess. Like I was up and down. Do I stay here? Do I even want to be a part of this company? But you're looking at all these employees were as much family to me as my family was. So we, put on our big boy pants and worked through it all. When we talk about these God moments of me getting sober, June 10th is the day I got sober, and June 10th is the day we went public. So to me, it was like God came back the second time around and said, here you go, you deserve something for all that.
Welcome to Unlocking Moves, where we want to cover those key pivotal moments and decision points that really change the lives of successful entrepreneurs and leaders. And I want to hear their stories because I think we learn the most from stories. But I don't want to hear just your glory stories. I want to hear your gory stories because, as I like to say, the bigger the shit show, the bigger the lesson. And speaking of shit shows, my guest today is one of my dear friends, John Flynn, who is, as I like to say, one of the goodest mofos out there. And he's got an amazing story that includes massive success, overcoming addiction, and also significant trauma. And John has agreed to share his story with us today. John, it's a pleasure to have you. Hey, but before I officially welcome you, you probably know that I like to hit my guests up with an off-the-wall question or comment to really keep them on their toes, keep my audience on their toes. You ready for this?
I'm ready.
So, John, I know you very well, and this is not very public information, but you have an addiction to houses. Buying, selling, flipping, and even building houses. And this, by the way, you were addicted to houses before you were even rich. So my question for you, John, is what is your problem? Why are you so addicted to houses?
Well, you talk about me being the one that has the addiction. The reality of that is I'm married to a girl that has that addiction, and I'm trying to help her through that so that every time I'm sitting here looking out the window at a home that's being built right now as we speak in hopes that we're going to be in it by next July. And based on my age of just turning 70, I am hopeful it's going to be the last one we ever get involved with building. So the truth of the matter is she's the one with the addiction and I'm just married to her.
Well, I thought you were going to throw that back at me and I was going to have to say, wait a minute. This is my show. You can't badmouth me. You can't make fun of me. But since it's Michelle.
I know I've been offered, for no equity, which I really appreciate, at least a 1/4 interest in your ranch, but I just wouldn't feel good taking that. So we'll let that be what it is.
Perfect. Well, hey, we're going to have a lot of fun, guys. As you can tell, my guest today is John Flynn. He is the co-founder of Open Lending. He was the chairman, and now he's since left the company back in January. But he and his partners grew that to a $4 billion market cap from very humble beginnings. John actually has humble beginnings. He started as a credit union teller in 1977. I was going to say, how the hell old are you? But you've just shared with us, just turned 70. He is a very caring, loving man. He's one of my dearest friends, and he has a heart for the underprivileged and underserved. And he has co-founded a treatment facility in South Carolina called Hammocks on the Edisto. John Flynn, welcome finally to Unlocking Moves.
Appreciate it, Kurt. I'm excited to be chatting with you here after all these years.
Let's go, man. Let's go. Hey, I want to get into your story. It's you've got a lot of accolades that we can talk about. We can talk about things like Austin's Fast 50 and Best Places to Work, Inc. 5000. You are the 2020 Ernst& Young Entrepreneur of the Year centrally in Central Texas, as well as a national honoree. And you did an IPO in 2020 with a unicorn, which is a company that grew to over $1 billion market cap, and you ended up growing it to over four. So there's some accolades, but hey, it wasn't that easy. So I want to get into some of your background. Where do you want to start? Do you want to start with, coming from a blue collar postal mail carrier family? Do you want to start with the story of Opelini? What do you think is the best place to start?
Yeah, I think going back to the early days, I think is relevant. And yeah, I was sitting here giggling a little bit when you talked about the bigger the episodes, the bigger the shit show, the bigger the whatever. And I think you knew this, but I was part of a church group there in Austin, Texas, that was called Chirp, Christ Renews His Parish, because I've got a very spiritual background because of the addiction deal. But what's funny is in this Catholic church environment, my nickname after sharing my story with all of these guys was the train wreck. That yeah, what a train wreck of a life you've lived to get to where you're at today. But yeah, to your point about going back to the beginning, yeah, I mean, I was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania. My dad was not just a mailman, but drove a tractor trailer. So he had two full-time jobs. He drove tractor trailer from like 7 in the morning till 3. Then he went to the post office from 3:30 to midnight. Probably worked 6 a week. Never got to see him a whole lot. So yeah, I'd like to make a point that you don't need to be born with a golden spoon in your mouth to get ahead in life. And a lot of times, it's those hard knock lessons that you learn growing up that make you want to work harder. Yeah, I went to a small state school in Pennsylvania where my tuition was $400 a semester for up to 18 credits. So it wasn't like there was a Harvard or a Yale ever even thought of in our life.
So that it's a Commonwealth University. Is that right? They're in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. Did you get that right?
It's right now it's called Bloomsburg University. It used to be called Bloomsburg State College. Used to be a teachers college of about 5,000 students. Had a football team that never won all 4 years that I went there, so we weren't known for our sports.
Well, look, humble beginnings, as they say, but let's go back to your dad, because I think a lot of that can be easily glossed over if we let it. But your dad worked two jobs. They weren't glamorous jobs. They were hard working jobs, driving a truck and then being a postal carrier in the Northeast, which is very snowy many times of the year. I'm sure the weather's not great. What did you learn from his work ethic? I know maybe he wasn't around as much as you would have liked, but he provided for his family. What did you learn from that?
Well, and I think that is the lesson that you learn there. I mean, to them, to show love back then was to provide. Yeah, we were thrilled to get a new pair of Keds or, what were they, All-Stars? That, the high tops, that, if you got 1 pair a year, you were thrilled.
Hey, by the way, most of my audience doesn't understand what that means, by the way. Can you put it into today's terms, maybe on?
No, I'm trying to think of what the name of the sneaker was, like,
I think it was
Converse
Keds.
All-Stars,
Oh, Commerce All-Stars. That's right. Chuck Taylor's.
Chuck Taylors. Yeah,
Yeah.
you got 1 pair of white high tops a year, you were thrilled. Yeah, but again, to your point, you only saw them on Sundays, and that was when we went to church and had dinner together, and it was just one of those things that you admired him for doing it. So even through high school, I worked in the school scrubbing floors, stripping, the gymnasium floors in the summer. So, and then I'd sneak off to baseball practice. So I was one of those kids, I went to school at 7:30 in the morning and never got home till 8 o'clock at night and thought nothing of it because you were either involved in baseball or working. And then, getting into college, even though he paid my tuition, room and board was on me. So every summer I worked in the steel mills of Pennsylvania making, it was for Elger Corporation. And I don't know if you've ever noticed their name is stamped on most sinks, bathtubs, and toilets. And we worked in the steel mills, but even back then, mid 70s, I was making $8 an hour as part of the steelworkers union. but it gave me enough money every summer to get through the next semester of school.
Wow, I did not know that you worked in the steel mill. So tell me a little bit about that, because as I understand, most of the times if you're in the coal industry or the steel industry, something like that, as a kid, you probably ain't getting out. Like, tell me about what did you know that you were going to go to school and you wanted to fly your, out of the nest, or did you think you might end up in the steel town?
No, unlike Rudy, I was determined that after working in the steel mills, I was not going to stick around. These things were so hot. There's no air conditioning. The nurse would actually come around every hour and make us take a salt tablet because you were sweating so bad every hour that they felt like you were going to dehydrate if you didn't, if you couldn't keep the sweat in. So it was one of those jobs that when you left there at night, you thought, I'm going to get a college education because I don't want to go through this every day.
Man, I can appreciate that. So there's some very powerful lessons in there, and I'm sure that's part of what ended up giving you that stick-to-itiveness and that grit to when you became an entrepreneur eventually. But I know you didn't go straight there. So you graduated from Bloomsburg State, then you went to when did you start the credit union industry as a teller?
So that's funny. I graduated on a Friday from Bloomsburg State, and that Saturday night, I was at a party, and a friend of mine said, "Hey, I'm working in Washington, D.C. as a doorman in the Capitol." And he said, all I really do is check IDs, making sure people going in and off the House floor are either the right lobbyist or the right person to get in. And you want to come hang out with me in D.C. for a week and party? And I thought, that sounds like just a fun week right after graduation. So I jumped in the car with him Sunday. We drove to D.C. He had an apartment in Suitland, Maryland. And I went down there and thought, a kid from Scranton. I had never really left Scranton. Ended up in D.C. hitting these bars on Pennsylvania Avenue. And I thought, this seems like a life in the fast lane, but I love this. So he introduced me to his boss at the time was a gentleman named Jim Malloy, who, if you're familiar with any of the structure at the House side of the Capitol, Jim Malloy was the doorkeeper of the House, meaning whenever you saw the State of the Union and the doors swung open, he was the gentleman that would come in and say, "Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States," and open up that whole thing. Well, all of the jobs on the House side of the Capitol fall under him. So he provided me with the ability to start. My first job on the Hill was working in the document room. So if anybody from a congressional office needed a copy of a particular bill, like HR 1151, whatever, they would come into that room, tell us what they want. You'd have to run around, find it, and give it to them. Well, those jobs were what were called patronage jobs, meaning each congressman had so many jobs he could fill on the Hill. About 1 month into that job, this kid walks in and says, "I'm here to replace John Flynn." The congressman, hired me from his district because I wasn't working for my congressman. So Jim Malloy, I'd gotten to know Jim at the time, and I went to see him. I said, "Hey, the patronage just fell through." And he said, "Well, you have an accounting degree. I'm the chairman of the board over a congressional credit union. Do you mind starting on the bottom level and being a teller?" So in October of 77, Bob Hess hired me as a teller at Congressional Credit Union, and that just started my credit union career.
Wow. Hey, I want to say a couple of things about this because, as you know, I have probably weekly, if not more, conversations with somebody whose son or daughter who just graduated from college or somebody in between jobs. And I often tell them, leverage your network, because even if you're not a rich, powerful person or your parents or whatever, you've got, people and they know people. And so what you did is you took a job that you probably didn't want in the copy room, the mail room there at the Capitol. Then maybe even a teller job that you didn't really care for, but those were foundational. It was your first job, your first foot in the door. Tell me a little bit about, comment on that, I guess. Today's episode is brought to you by Chinook Seedery, the best sunflower seeds ever. Available online at ChinookSeedery.com and Amazon or wherever you get your seeds, including Buc-ee's, Dick's Sporting Goods, Shields, Love's Travel Stops, Circle K, and thousands of other locations around the country.
Well, yeah, it's funny. And this stands out in my mind so vividly because my starting salary as a teller was $8,645 per year, like not per month, not. And I was like, and we survived on it. It was 1977. Um, I had an apartment in Arlington, Virginia. My rent was $201 a month, and that was all you included for a two-bedroom apartment. I was engaged when I went to DC to take that job to a girl that was originally from Scranton, like I was. She was a year behind me at Penn State. So we ended up getting married pretty soon right after she got out of college, 1979. And, it was a struggle to make ends meet, even with $201 a month. She got a job as an administrative assistant in downtown DC. And it was, I don't know what her salary was, but it was a tough gig trying to come up with the rent every month.
Yeah, and I know, people today complain about the amount of money they make and how much it costs to live, and obviously it's been a challenge for eternity, and you made it work. But let's fast forward a bit. So you were at the credit union, you worked there for a bit, and then I know there were some off the field issues, if you will, that you encountered. Was that later in your credit union life?
No, actually, the off the field incidents actually started before even getting to DC. It's one of those situations. Growing up in Scranton, I think it might be in the Guinness book. I'm not 100% sure, but I've heard rumor that Scranton is known to have more bars per capita than any city in the country. And all these were like little, street corner bars where you had a pool table. I could walk into a bar and get served at the age of 16. So, I was drinking actually pretty heavily even before high school ended. Going into Bloomsburg, it had escalated. When I got out of Scranton and moved away to college, it was like, all the limitations were off. I was out there partying every night, getting in trouble. And my first real incident with alcohol that would probably stop most people from drinking was a DUI at Penn State's main campus before I ever even graduated from college. And the funny part of that is as hard as my dad worked, he had lent me one of his cars. It was a former state police car that he paid $700 for. And the only reason he let me use it is because I painted his house that was going to cost him $700. So he said, you can paint the house and use the car, or I need to sell the car to get the money to paint the house. So here I am driving his car at Penn State. The same night that I got the DUI, I parked that car in a non-parking zone behind a dorm, and it got a parking ticket on it. So 3 weeks later, I'm back in Scranton at my dad's house, and registered mail comes to the house. And I hadn't told him about the DUI yet. So I saw the registered mail and I was like, oh shit. As he's opening the registered mail, I said, I got to tell you something, Dad. I got arrested at Penn State for a DUI. It wasn't pretty. I'm sorry. And when he opened up the mail, it was the parking ticket. I was like, damn. But back in those days, he went to court with me, drove all the way to Penn State, which was about a 2.5-hour drive, went to court. Back then, you got a $300 fine and you lost your license for 6 months. That's all. That was the repercussions of it. So, I just
to be clear, that was the repercussions for the DUI, not for the parking ticket.
For the DUI, that was. But then even when I got to DC, I was living there by myself the first year because I hadn't gotten married yet. And, being Irish with the name Flynn, there's an incredible bar there called the Dubliner. And a gentleman that I went to DC with was about to get married too. So we had a little bachelor party for him. And on my way home from that bachelor party, behind the Library of Congress, I took out 3 sawhorses in a row with my car with 2 cops behind me, 2 cops in front of me, got arrested, taken into a deep jail, which is not a pretty place, nothing I was ever proud of. And if you're familiar with any of the drinking laws, I blew a .28, and they thought the machine was broken because that's abnormally high. They went and got a new machine, and then the 30 minutes that I sat there, more alcohol absorbed into my system, and I blew a .32, which is just
Wow.
legally sort of dead for alcohol. So
And just to be, for everybody, a point one is drunk now, right? According to
Point
the
zero
DWI.
eight.
0.08. So you are 4 times the current legal limit
yes.
for alcohol, and you should have been dead, as you said. Wow.
And I don't tell you any of this as a drunk-a-log or like I said, nothing I've ever been proud of. You know, you look back at these days and you think you're invincible in college and, you know, in your younger life, and this stuff has a way to follow you. And I've come to realize that, you know, alcoholism ran rampant in my family, which we can get into a little bit more detail down the road here. But so yeah, here I am, a married jet, and I'm in front of a judge in D.C. And again, I got a good attorney. He takes me up front, just looks at me. He goes, "Mr. Flynn, I want you to remember you're no longer in the hills of Scranton, Pennsylvania. I'm going to charge you with improper driving and charge you a $100 fine," with a .32 staring at him.
Wow.
So, you know, these 2 incidents you would think would be plenty to make you stop drinking, but
Not when you get
more,
off that easy.
more to come.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's just it. I kept skating. So I thought, well, that's this not a big deal. I'll just keep going. You know, but I did settle down for a while. I got married. I had 2 children very quickly from that first marriage. Um, my position in the credit union grew pretty quickly. You know, credit unions were just growing at that time. Because I had a degree in accounting, I went from a teller to a loan officer to the accounting department, ultimately to a branch manager, all within the first 6 years of being there. And, life seemed to be good. It was, 1979 through 1983. And I was having a ball, raising 2 kids, having fun.
Okay, so you're growing professionally with the credit union. You're becoming well known in the space, at least in locally, and you're having fun at night. It sounds like you're probably still drinking with your buddies, with your family, and tell me a little bit more, because what I know about your story is that now you've been sober for 37 years.
34 as of June.
34 years. Congratulations. I know you're a very big proponent and advocate for AA. So tell me what finally sent you over the edge.
Well, in 1983, I was sitting at my desk reading an article where a smaller credit union was looking for someone to run it, a CEO. And I called them, and I think you know me. I'm not one that normally goes out and beats my own drum. I was always more of an introvert because of the drinking. And when I called this credit union to see if they would take me, for an interview, they said, that article shouldn't have even run this month. We think we've narrowed it down. And like just to blurt it out, I said, if you hire somebody before we talk, you're making a big mistake. And the guy was like, wow, well, yeah, come on in. So I went and interviewed. They weren't getting back to me. I finally called them back. And at this point, Congressional was growing, the credit union I was at. And they had just said to me, hey, we're going to do a whole reorg. We'd like you to help us rewrite the new org chart and build yourself into a nice position. So I called the smaller credit union and said, guys, I'd really like to come to work for you, but I need to know today. And they called me back 2 hours later, offered me the CEO job. So here I am, 28 years old, being offered a job as a CEO of a credit union, small credit union, but it was enough to give my ego this boost of, holy shit, now I'm running a credit union here in DC at the age of 28 with an accounting degree from a small state school. So,
Hey, wait. Let's pause here for a second. I know you're going to get into the juicy stuff, but before you do, I just want to highlight, you saw an opportunity, you sought it, you got basically told no by omission, if nothing else, and you kept after it for a bit, and you had the balls, if you will, to, demand the job or ask for the job, and you got it. My point is, that's a break that a lot of people would cower to, and you were bold enough to take the risk.
Yeah, like I said, I don't know where it came from either. It just kind of blurted out. And what's funny about that too, though, is like a month into the job, but the first board meeting, because as a result of being the CEO, I was offered a position as treasurer of the board. So in the first board meeting, I actually said to the board, I have to ask you guys, what made you hire me? And they said, believe it or not, it was because you sat and listened to what we wanted to do with the credit union instead of walking in the door telling us all the things you were going to do. And they said, we were looking for somebody that, we'd been here for 30 some years before we met you. We have a direction that we thought the credit union could go in. And we got the impression that you were willing to work with us to get it there versus telling us what you were going to do. So, the lesson for me was, the old adage, you have two ears and one mouth for a reason. A lot of times it's worth listening to. And, it's funny, even after that, when I gotten out of the credit unions and taken some of those Covey sales courses where I remember an example of if you're in a sales environment and somebody comes up to you and says, God, we love what you have. Does it come in blue? Instead of jumping out with 10 different colors of blue and, oh God, we have this, this, and this. There's a likelihood that person could come back and say, I just wanted to know because I hate blue. So you always want to dig in deeper with questions versus jumping in with the answer.
I love it. All right. So tell me, so this fed your ego, probably not in a healthy way, it sounds like. Tell me what happened next, maybe personally.
Well, 100%. So I'm running this credit union. Yeah, I've got for me back then, a fat salary, a company car, expense account. It led me to the point where I wanted to climb not just the corporate ladder there, but I'm getting on all these boards for the Metropolitan Area Credit Union Management Association, never going home, seeing the kids, drinking a lot. All of a sudden it leads to, 8 years into this, not getting along at home, drinking a lot. Come into 1989, we just decide, okay, this marriage isn't working, you're not around. And we decide to separate. And it's one of those things that, when you're partying that hard, and I can tell you the room I was sitting in, the color of the couch, the color of the walls when I told the kids that their mom and I were divorcing, and the look on their face, and I can't believe this is happening kind of thing. But, you make a commitment, you go down that path. And so 1989, I got separated, bought a townhouse by myself, but worked out a deal custody-wise that I wanted to be a part of their lives more than not. And we worked out a deal that I could pick the kids up every day from school. I coached Little League, I coached softball, we did dinners together, we did homework. But my ex-wife had enough sense to put in the separation agreements that I was not allowed to use alcohol in the presence of the kids. Well, by this point, my alcohol has skyrocketed. I'm not paying attention to that. I mean, I'm picking them up from school half wasted every day. Coaching Little League, having no right to having really done that. And then coming into 1991, they've been separated 2 years. In May of 91, I was out partying with a bunch of friends of mine, and again left the Dubliner, this Irish bar. And on my way home to the townhouse I was single at the time, I rear-ended somebody on Interstate 95 doing about 80 miles an hour, knocked them off the guardrails, hit them the second time, and left the scene of the accident. So when I didn't go home, and now because I'm such a big shot, I had a big boat on the Potomac River that I could sleep on. So I went and hid there for a day and a half. And when I woke up the next day so hungover, I called my attorney and just said, "Hey, here's what happened last night. Um, do you know if they're looking for me?" And one of the stupidest things I had done was I had vanity tags on the company car that I was driving with the initials of the credit union that I ran. And he did a little homework, called me right back and said, "They are looking for you. And if you were drinking, I wouldn't go home just yet. Stay on your boat for another day. Let's let the alcohol get out of your system." And we did that. I went to see the state trooper the next day to admit what I had done, and he said, he said, "Were you drinking?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, why'd you leave the scene of the accident?" And I had a little cut on my head from hitting it. I said, "I think I banged my head on the windshield, and I don't even remember the accident until I woke up the next day." And he said, "Well, I can't argue with that. I can't prove any different. The gentleman that you hit just wants his car fixed." So I made arrangements to fix it, got charged with improper driving again, and nothing happened. So that was May 9th. That car got fixed. There was like, I think, $14,000 in damage on it. I got that car back on a Friday. That Sunday, I went out on my boat all day. On my way home, was in a head-on collision with a gentleman and fortunately didn't kill anybody on June 9th. Spent the night in jail, which is the most ridiculous thing I've ever done. I never wanted to do it again. Woke up the next morning, called my brother, who was 9 years sober, asked him to make arrangements to get me help. And if you remember, 34 years ago, it was a payphone that you put a quarter in. So he made arrangements. I flew to Pennsylvania, checked into a 30-day treatment center. And here I showed up with my golf clubs, my tennis racket, thinking I'm going to the Betty Ford Clinic. When I got out of the car, I asked him to carry all that shit in so it looked like he was checking in. And he was like, "Yeah, you just still don't get it. That's not how this works." So checked in 2 weeks there. Didn't want to be there. I was really going there to avoid jail. And something clicked the third week where I started to realize how alcoholism is a true physical disease. It's an inherent disease. And I just started to get it. It was a very spiritual program. That the day I got out of treatment, I flew back to DC, and that night I was the chairman of a trade association. The night that I landed, I had to make a presentation to 200 people, and after 30 days of being taught to stand up at a podium and say, "Hi, my name's John. I'm an alcoholic," I was like, "Please don't let that flow off my mouth." I actually had to step aside, say it to myself, and then get on with the presentation. But I came out of that treatment June 10th of 90, or checked in on June 10th of 91, and I've never had a drink since.
Man, that's awesome. I love that you became clean. I'm not. I don't love the initial part, but I know God has a way to make it our time when we finally realize that it's time. I just want to point out that those 3 or 4 or 5 incidents that happened prior, and you didn't get in trouble, really, and obviously you finally started feeling it. I think with the rear end collision, but even that wasn't much. I just I think the more we get our kids or get ourselves out of trouble without any real trouble, the more we become they enable us to continue our bad habits. And so I'm just glad, I guess I'm glad that you finally hit rock bottom without killing somebody, right? Without really changing someone's life for the bad. And I think you're blessed in that didn't happen. You got
Yeah.
taught your lesson, but nobody got, hurt, so to speak.
Well, I was fortunate in that way, to your point. I was one of the lucky ones, and you know a little bit more about, you've heard me talk about the two kids in the middle of divorce, and that there's been a lot of tragedy in their lives, in our whole family's life, and it's all over alcohol. When my son was 18, he was involved in a fatality car accident. Less than 3/10 of a mile from the accident, he was seen not driving the car. Him and a friend hit a tree. The friend was ejected from the car and died. And when the police got there, he was in the driver's seat. My son was. Because they were drinking so heavily, he didn't remember the accident and pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter, and to this day has that felony on his record as a result of it. So, yeah, I mean, it comes in all different shapes and sizes. It's a horrible family disease for us, and sometimes you pay a much deeper price than I had to.
Yeah, you mentioned that it's a horrific disease in you and your family. So many Americans have the same disease of alcoholism and alcohol abuse and various types of alcohol usage. What would you say? What are some pieces of advice that you could give somebody who might be having their own challenges, or maybe their kids are having challenges, maybe a loved one or a friend? Because I, I've got too many people that I know who suffer from various forms of alcoholism.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be it was such a stigma. My and I share this all the time. I still go to 3 AA meetings every week. 34 years into this. Um, I I think you remember when we office near each other. I put my offices where they were because there was AA meetings in the building next door. So I could go literally every day if I wanted to. And it used to be I thought an alcoholic was the guy you see standing on the corner of Bee Caves and Mopac with a sign begging for money or living with a shopping cart next to him. And when I checked into treatment and started to patronize with all these different there was 4 doctors in my group that were in treatment because they were drinking and got caught with alcohol on their breath doing their rounds.
Oof.
One of these guys lived between Lawrence Taylor and Richard Nixon in New Jersey, real high-end treated migraine headaches with liquid cocaine and got addicted to it himself. So, I mean, it's one of those diseases that, it's like cancer. It affects, you don't ask for it. You never see it coming. Yeah, you can start out drinking 1 or 2 drinks and next thing it's 3 or 4. And I mean, I was up to a point where I was doing no less than 12 beers a day. On the weekends, I was drinking as high as a case. And today, with my kids, it's I mentioned getting married early. My ex-wife died at the age of 56, drank herself to death in her bedroom. So my 2 kids have seen addiction from both sides. And a lot of times it's not, we always say in the meetings as well, alcohol is but a symptom of the disease. A lot of times it's mental illness disguised as alcoholism, where you just don't like who you are or what you're doing, or you can escape that person. 2 or 3 drinks changes who you are. And I used to, if I was on my way to a function for work, I'd have 3 or 4 beers before I got there to make me feel like I was capable of chatting with everybody in that room. And then it just gets away from you. So yeah, you're right. We call it also enabling. I've tried to buy I've tried to buy sobriety for my kids. You know, if you'll do this, you'll get a car. If you'll do it doesn't work. Yeah, they have to want to get, the other thing we say in AA is, it's a program of attraction rather than promotion. People see the change in you and they want to know what happened? What's different about you? I've had a vendor once tell me at lunch, I can't figure out what's different about you. You're not such an asshole anymore. You gotta say, well, thanks for that. I mentioned, for me, spirituality. Um, and I get emotional when I think about, that one night that I spent in jail. It's the very first time I ever hit my knees in that next to a metal bed. And I just said, God help me. I didn't put restrictions on it. I used to always say, God, if you'll do this, I'll do that. And, you know, God didn't want condition. My old business partner, Sandy, I love this guy. One day we were talking about something like this. And I said, Sandy, I can't wait to get to heaven. I have so many questions for God. I want to know why he does what he does. Sandy looked at me and said, Flynn, I'd be real careful. I think God has more questions for you than you could ever have for him. I was like, all right, touche, I get it.
Thanks for sharing, John. I really appreciate that. I know that you say you go to 3 meetings a week. I know that's true. And I also know that anybody that I come across that is struggling with any kind of alcoholism or has a family member, I can point them to you and you take them under your wings, and you've sponsored more people than I know you can count in various rehab and AA type settings. So thank you. And I know you wouldn't be doing those things if you hadn't gone through them yourself. And so, your past is your past, and that's made you who you are. And it's one of your strengths is that empathy and understanding. So thank you.
No, I appreciate it. And well, as you know, I attribute all of the success since going through treatment to getting sober. The next phase of that was 4 years into sobriety, I got bored at work. I felt guilty taking a paycheck. This place was running by itself. I had met my now wife, which is incredible, of 30 years.
Except for her addiction for houses you mentioned
It's
earlier.
her addiction to houses and horses. Yeah, but I still love her too much to do anything about it. She's been the best thing that's ever happened to me. Yeah, she's never known me to drink. I met her 4 years into sobriety. As a result of her, stepped outside of my comfort zone once again. At the credit union, I'm making good money, never having to go into the office. And between her and the company she was working for, they convinced me to come over and get into the brokerage arena. She was going to be the analyst. I was going to be the sales arm. We did 2 trades for a brokerage firm that netted me more money in 30 days than I was making in a year. And I realized the minute I got that commission check that the reason it was so high is we were not disclosing the fees properly. Yeah, it's too detailed to get into here, but yeah, here I was selling these investment products to friends of mine that were CEOs of credit unions. And I thought, I won't be able to sleep at night knowing what's going on here. So Michelle and I quit the exact same day. We just thought this isn't any way to live. We weren't even a thing. She was a business partner. We just started hanging out together. Um, Things went in a different direction for the two of us. We started dating. We started a company together that she continued to build and run. And she built a very successful asset liability management company, which managed investment portfolios and did asset liability management for credit unions. And she ran that successfully until 2018. I was kind of her sales arm for that because I knew all these CEOs of credit unions, so I could bring them to the table, and she managed all their portfolios. So yeah, we did that for 3 or 4 years together.
Hey, John, if you will, I'd love to jump to Open Lending. I know you, I'm not exactly sure how you found them. You ended up moving from the East Coast to Austin, Texas. Tell me a little bit about that story. And then that's where you and I pick up, because I think I met you a couple of years into that journey. And then obviously a slow, methodical, ultimate rocket ship ride with Open Lending.
Yeah, that's what, like, at the end of that 4 years, I got a call from a headhunter that I had done some business with in the credit union space, asking me if I would be interested in moving to Austin, Texas, to get involved with a startup. And that this was 1999 when private equity was throwing money at .coms. If you just put the word .com on the end of your company name, you were going to get funded.
Yep.
So Michelle and I moved to Austin, and I took a job as a head of sales for a company that was going to be called goodtoseeyou.com. And in the process of building that out, there was different elements of it that would cater to different pieces of the financial sector the credit unions needed. Lending platforms, savings platforms, things like that. So we had a loan origination platform that we were using called FiData. And 6 months into Good to See You, we realized it just wasn't going to go anywhere. We had spent $9 million in 6 months. Funding was just not going to get there. And one of the gentlemen that was a co-founder in FiData said, you know what, if Good to See You is not going to make it, why don't you come over and run this startup for me, we'll be able to go out and we had 80 credit unions on that data loan origination platform. And anybody that, if you remember back in those days, most credit unions would not give you a car loan unless your credit score was well in excess of 700, 720. It's known as your FICO score. So we had all these credit unions running applications through this data loan origination platform, of which 50% might get approved and 30% of those would get funded. And we looked at each other, Sandy and myself, the gentleman I mentioned earlier, said, there's got to be a home for these loans. If the credit unions don't want it, how can we turn that into an earning asset instead of selling it off to a subprime lender? So we went out and bought all the data we could find. And at the time we were putting this together, a third gentleman, Ross Jessup, came in that was going to be the CFO of a few of Sandy's companies. And the three of us started buying all the credit data we could find to determine how can you insure a car loan against default like you do a mortgage with PMI insurance. And nobody had ever heard of that. So we put our heads together. We developed all these underwriting technology, went and pitched the idea to a large insurance company that insured most of the credit unions in the country and got them to buy into the idea of PMI for auto. So we formed a joint venture with them. In 2003, they agreed to give us a couple $1 million to build out the technology. We developed these underwriting rules. They had a sales force that we used to grow the business. And over we had a 5-year with this company that at the end of 5 years, this joint venture would be up for grabs. We could either put it to them or they could call it from us. So, and as you can well imagine, 5 years into that joint venture, if we started at 03, here we come into 08, when the economy is starting to turn horrible. So we exercised our put.
So that means you basically put on paper that they have to buy the company, if I remember what a put is. Okay.
That's exactly right. We want you to buy it, and we're forcing you to do it. The agreements at the time said that if we did that, each of the two companies, that insurance company and our company, would each go out and get a valuation done by an independent actuary firm. So we came back with we just had a board meeting 2 weeks before we did that, and we agreed that the company was going gangbusters, growing at huge percentages. We had just generated $11 million in cash that year, and our valuation came back with a multiple that showed we were worth at the time $147 million. Their valuation came back saying $9 million. They forgot that we had taped the board meeting.
You recorded the board meeting.
We had recorded the board meeting.
Which they were in attendance.
That they agreed that we were going to grow this thing huge the next 5 years. So we ended up in arbitration in federal court. The arbitration said that the third party that would step in had to pick one of those two, not come up with a third. Obviously, once we played the tape, our attorney won. They came back to us and said, "What do you want?" We said, "We want your 50% interest in the company and a check for X." And they agreed to give us X. And we looked at each other and said either that was the smartest move we've ever made or the stupidest, because how are we going to find an insurance company in 08 that wants to insure subprime auto loans?
So you basically you won the arbitration. So they in theory were supposed to buy your company for $147 million, but as I recall, because I know the story, they didn't have enough money at the time. So they're like, "Look, we just want you to go away." You ended up with their half of the company, which in theory is worth $73 million, and they wrote you a check. So you looked very good on paper, but like you said, oh shit, what do we do now?
That's right. I'm not normally a vindictive type person, but to get their 50% interest in the company, we had to pay them $1. So I nailed them 4 quarters taped to an envelope and thanked them for their 50% interest.
Well, you would have sent 100 pennies if it didn't cost you $10
I
to
know it
send
would
it.
have cost too much to mail. We didn't have that kind of money.
That's awesome. All right, so hey, we're running short on time. I know this is a great step, but let's talk a little bit about you found a carrier or two that helped you, and you were, I don't know how much you can disclose about revenue. You were doing okay. Or actually, you were zero there for a while, but then, man, something happened. You went up into the right. Tell me a little bit about that story, and let's get
Yep.
to the juicy stuff.
Yeah, to your point, we started right. We burned through that money that we got developing more technology. Yeah, that's 08, 09. We found a carrier. We wrote our first new loan in 2010. 2010, 11, 12, it starts to take off. 2014, we go out and get our first private equity money. And all this time, we're doing 25,000, 15,000. At the time when we actually did go public, we had 183 shareholders. But in 2016, we sold 40%, 27% of the company for $40 million. So we were starting to make money. We took some money in the door. We did distributions to some friends and family that helped us get there. They came into the deal with the premise that we're private equity. We like to get triple our money back in the next 3 to 4 years. So they made us go out and get a second carrier. They made us, put a lot of processes in place, which we needed. Yeah, we were running the company on QuickBooks, shoestring, but they brought a lot of policies into place that helped us grow the company. So we start growing again. We come into late 2019 and we start the process again of, okay, what's the next exit? And in 2019, we met a firm called FT Partners that came in and talked to us. They did a lot of private equity deals. And we were debating, do we sell to a strategic? Do we go through an IPO? And then we're at this dinner down in Boston, and he says, or we can consider a SPAC. And Ross and I are literally Googling under the table, what the hell does SPAC mean?
The
Which is,
SPAC stands for Special Purpose Acquisition Corp, right? So tell me,
yep.
what does that mean exactly, or for layman's terms?
So what it means is these private equity firms go out and actually, it's almost like a reverse merger in that they've raised money and labeled a public company. They might raise $200 million, and then they have to, fill what they call the pipe and get it up to a certain number. But a SPAC, once you form it, you only have a certain period of time to bring a company into it and have it be a public company, where you have to give back that money to the investors. But what a SPAC allows you to do versus an IPO is look at forward projected numbers. So we had these, we were growing huge at the time. So it allowed us to get a valuation at the time when we decided to do this of $1.3 billion based on the revenues we were generating.
So you bought the company back, or you received the company back and cash. So you basically got it for negative money. And that was in 2009, 10-ish.
Yeah, 2008, 2009.
All right. Then 2016, you took private equity money, 27% you said for 40% stake. So what's that math? About $80 million or so in theory, valuation. 4 years later, 3.5, 4 years later, now you're going public for 1.2 billion. So I want everybody to hear that. And then just to fill in the gap on the SPAC. So a reverse merger is basically somebody buys a public company shell, a public company that's now out of business, but their public part is still worth something. And so basically they took that shell, combined it with Open Lending's operating company, and then put several $100 million into it to fund the growth and pay some shareholders. And so that's how you became public, through a reverse merger SPAC transaction for 1.2 billion. Okay.
And that's all in the middle of COVID 2020. And, when you mentioned some of the adversity. So, here we are going gangbusters. We're coming into the end of 2019 when we're going to make that announcement that we're going to go public. And on the end of December, the day we're announcing that we're going to do that, I get a call that my 40-year-old daughter was found dead from an accidental overdose with 3 young children. So, you got the extreme high. here we are, we're going public, we're going to all be millionaires, and extreme lows of holy shit, the world just came to an end. So for me to try to stay focused from January 1st until June 10th when we went public was a real mess. Like I was up and down. Do I stay here? Do I even want to be a part of this company? But you're looking at all these employees were as much family to me as my family was. So we, put on our big boy pants, and Michelle and I ended up with a few more kids than we thought we'd have for a while. Worked through it all, worked from South Carolina. And on June 10th, we actually hit the NASDAQ as a public company called LPRO, Lempro. And when we talk about these God moments of me getting sober, June 10th is the day I got sober, and June 10th is the day we went public. So to me, it was like God came back the second time around and said, here you go, you deserve something for all that.
And well, I remember those days being special to you, and I thank you for sharing that. Obviously, I was around when your daughter passed, and through all that process, and so I'm familiar with the story. But man, it it, it kind of gets you worked up, choked up a bit just hearing it. Appreciate you sharing that, and really, it's a good reminder for all of us that no matter what you see from the outside, no matter what you know about a person, and there's something going inside and on in their life. We never really truly know their story, and everybody's going through something. And I just encourage everyone out there to remember that no matter what you think about somebody in their journey, there's something going on behind the scenes that you don't know. And it's not always good. Thank you
Yeah,
for
and to your
sharing.
point, when you talked about, you mentioned it, the treatment center, as a result of that incident, I met a person here in Charleston, and we opened up an all-female drug and alcohol addiction center called Hammocks on the Edisto that caters to just women. And what's beautiful about that is the women feel so much safer in an environment where they can talk openly about abuse they've had, about like we talked about in the very beginning of this. It's not always the alcohol, the drug. It's what led them there. What was the deep rooted cause of them going there? And it could be spousal abuse. It could be any number of things that when you get them away and get them opening up about that stuff, and it just really changes their lives to be able to watch them get better and get on with life.
And I love what you're doing with that. And remind me your business partner's name, Victor?
At the treatment center, it's Virgil
Virgil.
Alfaro,
Virgil,
and
yeah.
Michelle. My wife, as much as she's never had other than addicted to houses and horses. I don't know that we can help her with that down there, but it's amazing how when she comes to these meetings, I usually go down there a couple of times a year and just kind of share my story about why I'm doing what I'm doing with the treatment center. And she leaves there every time going, God, we got to get more involved with this. Yesterday we hosted a golf tournament here at my club in Charleston. I sit on a foundation board for PenFed Credit Union that caters to veterans. And we do cohorts 3 times a year where we help vets position themselves for their next phase of life, businesses they want to start, how to pitch their deals, to go find private equity. And Michelle was a big part of that yesterday. And it becomes addictive. When you see the changes that you can make in somebody's life for the positive, it just doubles itself every time.
I had Nate Thomas on the show a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things we both described was when you're addicted to helping others, it's you almost feel selfish because
Yeah.
you're helping others, and you look like a whatever because you're supporting and helping and doing things, and at the same time, you're getting so much out of it that it's almost a reverse. You feel guilty because you feel so good about helping others.
Yeah.
Hey, John, let's talk just briefly about what happened after that at Open Lending. You guys went public at 1.2 or so billion dollars, if I recall, 10 or so dollars a share. You guys got up to 43 or $45 a share. So 4 or $4+ billion in market cap. Amazing ride. And so I just want to highlight that. So you're a unicorn times four. And tell me a little bit about that ride.
Well, yeah, and that was a neat thing. None of us believed it, and maybe it was overvalued looking back on it. We'd like to think not, but the beauty of what FT Partners and an attorney that, thanks to you, you introduced us to him, was that we were able to structure the deal in a way that if we hit certain thresholds of stock price, the senior management team at Open Lending earned back any of the stock that we were able to sell. So within the first 6 months, we were not only able to liquidate a portion of our holdings. Obviously, as the CEO of the company, you're not going to go public and sell everything you have. It wouldn't look right. So we were limited in what we could get rid of, but we were able to earn back what we sold, that at the end of that 90 or 120 days or 6 months, we were in the same position as when we started, but having taken some cash off. And to your point, it ran from $10 the day we came out, that I think it hit a high of 43 something within the first 6 months. And it stayed up in the 40s and 30s for quite some time.
Yeah. It was an amazing run.
COVID's had a real impact
Yeah.
on, the auto industry. Just with people weren't out, you couldn't go buy cars during COVID. The chip manufacturers all were shut down. The wiring harnesses were made in Ukraine. So, there's all these different elements that have driven the stock significantly lower today. But the company, it's one of those double-edged swords. If we weren't public, we wouldn't have to account in what was known as 606 accounting. And a lot of our revenue came from insurance profits from the performance of the insurance on the loan. If, in the absence of 606, our company would still be worth significantly higher than what it is today.
Wow. Well, let me give a brief commercial, if we can, to our friend, the attorney that you've mentioned a couple of times, David Washburn with Catton in Dallas. We're unpaid commercial. He was able to negotiate a pretty slick deal with you with that insurance company to get half the company back and some cash. And he was able to do some triggers when you went public. And I'll say a good attorney is worth his weight in gold, and David is one of them. By the way, David has an addiction to cars, but we don't need to talk about him. I think is that attorney-client privilege? How does that work, John?
I think you're good with that. He's in this really high-end older Mustangs. So he just doesn't know when to stop spending money on them.
He is a good dude as well. Hey, let me a couple more questions here before we break. And the big one is, the show is called Unlocking Moves. The idea is to identify those key unlocking moments or pivotal moments that changed your life in a really any way, usually in a positive way. But tell me, I know we've covered several of them. What are the ones that stick out to you as those aha moments of unlocking moves?
A lot of it's not just on the business side. And again, I just went and spoke to a bunch of veterans, about exactly this. And for me, believe it or not, it was getting sober and finding God in a way that, I just trusted that he was going to lead in the right direction. And I've made some stupid decisions over time, but sometimes they just turn around and work out as a result of having that trust. Meeting Michelle was definitely a one of the more positive things. Here's a woman that 9 years younger than me, gorgeous, a 4.2 from Columbia in finance and business. Obviously, the brains behind most things that we did, and just believing in what you're going to do. I think the first big aha moment for us at Open Lending was selling 27% of the company for $40 million. We were like, oh man, when you're starting that path, you don't realize until you bring in the right people. We had blinders on. We were growing the business. We had no idea it was worth until we started talking to private equity guys. And to your point, being able to look for those connections. When I talked to PenFed, it was one of those things I talked about. I had, no background in this, no cash, and I didn't know a soul in DC. But it was being able to find the right people and not being afraid to ask for help. that got us where we were going.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's making those connections, reaching out on your own. And Nate Thomas, one of the things I loved about his episode was he said that asking for help became a superpower for him. And if you can do it well, you can do well. Hey, I consider myself the listener's advocate, John. This is a question from my friend Rod Kurtz, and that is, if I've sitting here with John Flynn for an hour long episode, what would I want to ask? What would I want Kurt to ask? So the question I came up with is, I've heard you describe yourself, and I've seen you described in other ways as someone who measures your success by lives changed. And I know that you've worked with a lot of borrowers and creditors and people that have needed change, or even folks with addictions, right? What's your favorite story about somebody that you've worked with or served or helped that you'd be willing to share online?
Well, the one thing that, when we talked about open lending, yeah, maybe one of the details that we didn't even dig into deep enough was I mentioned we created this PMI insurance for mortgages. Most credit union members, if they didn't have a 700 score, they were subjected to these buy here, pay here lots, with scores down in the high 500s, paying interest rates of 24%. What we developed, and because we deployed it into credit union space, for those of you that don't know it, credit unions don't pay taxes. They're a bank, but they don't pay 40% taxes. So their cost of capital is significantly less than any bank. Using credit union funds, we were able to take what a consumer would typically be stuck with, a 22% interest rate. We could get that interest rate down to about 11 and still get the credit union a 300 basis point net ROA on that piece of paper, which was higher than they could get on any investment they made. So we used to like to say, that we were doing well by doing good. And we believe that, if you take consumers that are struggling to find their way, to get into a car that they can get to work. We had so many people, testimonies. I think if you go to the Open Lending website even, there's a video on there of a situation where a young guy that parks cars at a restaurant in Austin applied for a loan at a credit union that uses us, and how it changed his entire family's life, that he could go get a better job. He could do different things. Yeah, you save somebody $300 a month on a car payment. That's a huge deal.
It's awesome. That's awesome. I know you've had a lot of success stories like that you show to folks, and you live yourself. And so I know that makes you feel good to both do well financially, but also do good for society.
Well, I know you're running short here. I'll make this a very quick story, but I mentioned to you, for me, the rewarding part is helping people with addiction as much as with car payments. But you've heard me tell this story, but Michelle and I used to commute back and forth quite a bit from Austin to Charleston, which is where our summer home was. We lived on Southwest Airlines. As y'all know, open seating. I had the exit row aisle. Michelle had the exit row window. The plane's half empty. This kid comes walking down the aisle, passes us, comes back and sits in the middle seat in between Michelle and I. I'm pissed off now. I'm like, damn it. All these empty seats, this guy can go sit anywhere. Plane takes off. I look over to talk to Michelle for something, and I see this kid sitting there with the phone in his hands. He opens it up, and I see these two big letters, AA. And I look at him and I said, "Is that AA literature you're reading?" He said, "It is." "Why?" I said, "Because I read that book when I first got sober 26 years ago." He goes, "Are you serious? You're sober?" I said, "Oh yeah, AA saved my life." So he drops the phone in his lap. And I said, "Have you decided?" I said, "Where are you going, to Charleston?" He goes, "Yeah, my dad just literally picked me up 30 minutes ago from a treatment center. I've been in there for 90 days. I'm going to visit my mother, and I'm petrified that I'm going to drink on this airplane." And I looked at him and I said, "I don't think you need to worry about that today." I said, "Have you picked out some AA meetings?" He said, "No, not yet. I don't believe in God. And I know AA is a very spiritual program, I'm not too sure AA's for me. I looked at him and I said, who do you think sat you between my wife and I? And he literally just looked at me and he goes, oh shit, how can I even argue with that? My wife and I walked into a meeting a year later. This kid was leading the AA meeting. He looks up at the two of us and he goes, oh my God, there's my two angels from row 16. I was like, man, you can't, that's the kind of stuff I live for, to see that.
I know I got the feels. I'm pretty sure our audience got the feels too, John. Thank you for sharing. Man, I appreciate that very much. Hey, I have one more question I like to ask. Honestly, I'd like to end on that because it's such a great story, but I want to ask this question. What is one question you're never asked and either you wish they would, or you're kind of secretly glad that they don't?
That's weird. I don't know. A lot of people, I'm sure, want to ask me if Michelle is blind. How did I end up with such a pretty fun wife? I think you've asked that a few times.
I know she's blind. I know she's blind, and she's her nose doesn't work either, obviously. You know what? On that point, let's wrap this puppy up. John, thank you so much for joining me. I want to ask everybody out there to please go like and subscribe. We're making some great progress, and we've got a great show, especially this one with my friend John Flynn. Thank you so much for joining me, man.
Thanks, Kurt.
If you're an entrepreneur and you think you might have outgrown a member of your team, or maybe you've got a mic, as we talked about in Who's Your Mic, check out this quiz at who'syourmic.com/quiz. That's who'syourmic.com/quiz.